Good to see you all here this morning as we continue in our series studying the book of Nehemiah. We're in chapter 2, as you know, this week, so it's a good time to pull out your Bibles and go ahead and pull those out. I've noticed that people have started bringing iPads and Kindles, and that's great, actually. You know, we say this, silence your cell phones and all that at the beginning, but if you're using your cell phone to read the Bible, that's okay. If you're taking notes on your iPad, that's okay. Those things are okay. Actually, somebody last night at the 5 o'clock service was taking pictures of the screens and taking notes on their iPhone. I thought that was a great use of an iPhone in worship. So pull those out. The other thing I'm going to ask you to pull out is your note sheet. We have a sermon note page there in your bulletins this morning. Go ahead and pull those out. Open up to Nehemiah chapter 2. I'm also the ushers are ready too. I'm going to ask you to actually get a pen out as well this week because we're going to do a little assessment here in the sermon this morning. I'm going to give you some time to do that. The ushers have pens in hand right now. If you need a pen, just raise your hand and they will come bring you a pen. Raise them high, don't be bashful, and they'll bring you a pen. They're all around. They'll come right to you as soon as they can. So I am ready to go to the beach. Anybody ready to go to the beach this week? Yeah, I'm not going this week, but I'll be here, but we're ready to go to the beach. One of the things I like to do when I go to the beach is I like to go into the wave. I love the ocean, swimming in the ocean, waves. I grew up, in a time, my dad taught me how to body surf when I was a kid because that was before boogie boards. I grew up in the time before boogie boards. That really dates me, I know. And I kind of came of age as a teenager when boogie boards came out. So I learned to body surf first, and then boogie boards came out, and I learned to boogie board, and I still do that. And then as I got older, I would rent surfboards, and I learned how to surf. And so I did all these things because I love getting in the ocean. I love riding waves. There's a couple of things to ride a wave. In fact, how many people here have ever tried to ride a wave? You ever tried to get in the ocean and ride it? Yeah, a lot of people have tried this. There's two things it requires. The first thing it requires is patience. Especially when it's calm, you sit out there and you wait and you wait and you wait for the right wave to come in, and you're looking out on the horizon, you're looking for a big wave, a good wave to come in, so you're waiting and waiting for the right wave. So it takes a matter of patience. But then when the right wave comes along, it's also then becomes a matter of timing. So if you want to catch that wave, you've got to time it just right. You got to get in position to catch that wave and to ride that wave and enjoy the ride. Because if you don't get it just right, if you don't time it just right, what happens? You wipe out, or you just miss it altogether and the wave goes by. So those are the two things. The wave will go on by you and you wait for the next one, or you get in it and you're in the wrong position and you get tumbled around and you get a nice clearing of your sinuses with salt water and you're tumbled around the sand. And so you think about that. And so it's about patience and timing. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that's what's been going on with Nehemiah in his prayer life. And that's how God works in our prayer lives as well. Sometimes it takes patience for us to wait for God's answer to our prayers. And then when that wave of opportunity comes, when we see that prayer answer coming, are we timing it right? Are we getting ourselves in position to actually catch that wave of opportunity that God is providing for us? That's what's happening with Nehemiah. Remember, he's been praying, we talked about this last week, he's been praying for how long? How long has Nehemiah been praying? Over 100 days, at least 100 days, 3 to 4 months he's been praying about this, looking for the wave of God, the opportunity to go and speak to the king. And then he's at this banquet, and the opportunity is presenting itself, and he's starting to position himself for the answer to that request and to that prayer, just like catching that wave. That's what's going on with Nehemiah and his prayer life. And it's interesting because this is actually the prayer we read about in the beginning of chapter 2 in the first few verses. And what we're seeing actually is these factors coming together to give him an opportunity. Now, he was a cupbearer, as we know from last week, and he was serving the king. And when someone serves us at a restaurant, we talked about this as well, or serves us drinks or whatever, what do we expect their demeanor or their attitude to be when they serve us? What do you think? I think I interpreted all that, but that was great. So you expect them to be kind, hospitable, in a good mood. You expect them to smile, right? And say, what can I get you? And so you're hospitable. It was also the same expectation for Nehemiah. When he went to the king expected to find a very hospitable, smiling Nehemiah coming to serve him his drinks. But on this particular occasion, he notices something different about Nehemiah. In fact, he had seen Nehemiah before. He knew that Nehemiah had typically been great to work with, but he notices a change in Nehemiah's demeanor. And it's at this moment that the king then opens the door for his request. The wave for his answered prayer is coming. And so Nehemiah jumps in. He jumps into the wave of opportunity, and he starts to make his request. And he gains confidence as the king begins to honor his request. And so in a split moment, Nehemiah goes from cupbearing to construction. That's their first point in your outline this morning, if you're following along. He goes from being cupbearing to construction. This is a big career change, to go from serving and waiting on tables, to now doing full-blown construction work. The big change in careers for Nehemiah at this point. Now, some scholars actually think that they talk about in the ancient history, there was this annual feast that kings would host. And at that annual feast would be an opportunity that at this annual feast that the tradition of the kings was to honor all requests that were made of the king in that particular feast. Some scholars think this may have been the feast that the Persian king was hosting that night. And so whatever request came to him, whatever request he entertained, he was in a mood to grant. Does that make sense? And so that might have been what's going on. It also didn't hurt that the queen was sitting next to him, because sometimes our queens help us make better decisions, right? Can I get an amen from the gentleman this morning? All right. You got an amen, Paul? All right, good. So sometimes they help us make those decisions. So we don't know, but we can speculate about that. So his prayer is answered. He gets sent off with letters and supplies and safe rites of passage back to Jerusalem. And in verse 11, we find that he has been in Jerusalem for how long? How long has he been there? Verse 11. 3 days. So he's been there for 3 days. And then notice what he does next. He goes out, not during the day, but at night. He takes a few others with him, and it's almost like this little secret inspection that he's going on. And he enters out. If you look on your outline this morning, there's a map on your outline. And you can see, if you look at that map, on the left-hand bottom side is the gate that he goes out of, called the Valley Gate. And so he goes out that gate, and he begins to move south and counterclockwise around Jerusalem and inspecting the walls and the gates. And he goes around to each of those gates, as you see on that map. But he stops before when he gets to about, sorry, I got to look at my map. When he gets towards the water gate on the right-hand bottom side, he actually moves off into what's known as the Kidron Valley, and that's off to the right. He turns around because he can't go any further, and he comes back to the Valley Gate and goes in. So one of the things just to point out is that he only inspects basically half of the walls, but it's enough for him to get a sense of what needs to happen, what rebuilding needs to happen, where the problems are, where the places are that the walls are falling down. And so he knows where the work needs to be done. So this is really, as we look at steps to rebuilding our own relationship with God and rebuilding our lives with God, here's the first step. The first thing that Nehemiah does is he assesses the situation. And that's what we need to do as well. We need to sometimes stop and assess the situation. And so in your outlines this morning, there is a assessment for you to do. And I want to walk through with you that this morning. This is where your pen comes in handy, your note page comes in handy. And so I actually want to ask you to go along with me and take your pen out and look at this assessment with me. I actually borrowed these areas of what I'm calling our spiritual walls, where we want to strengthen our spiritual walls. And so I want to look at these 5 spiritual walls in our lives. And I've adapted this from a book called Ultimately Responsible that our staff read a couple years ago. And these 5 areas are outlined in the book. And then I kind of put together this little scale for us to look at. So 1 is poor, and 3 is average, and 5 is excellent or great. So I'm doing great in this area, or I'm not doing so great in this area. So I'm going to just walk through this and then give you a moment just to mark where you feel like you are. Go with your gut and just kind of assess your own relationship, your own spiritual health this morning as we go through this. So the first one is physical health. Everybody there? It says, I care for my body as God's temple by eating healthy, exercising, and getting enough rest. Last week we talked about where is God's temple in the New Testament? We're God's temple. Our bodies are God's temple. Are we taking care of God's temple? So assess where you feel like you're doing in that area of your life. Maybe just mark where you feel you're at on that scale. Again, let me also say, I'm not going to ask you to share this with your neighbor or anything next to you, or you're not going to have to hand this in. This is for your personal edification, your personal encouragement for yourself. So that's number one, physical health. So go ahead and mark where you feel like you're at right now. The next one is mental health. It says, I have the mind of Christ and seek to renew my mind by thinking about what is noble, right, true, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. I seek to know God's will. And this is about what is it that we think about? What is our mindset? What are the things we put into our minds? And what do we think about most? Are we thinking about those things that are God's will, those lovely things, those praiseworthy things, those excellent things, or are our minds filled with other things? So that's the next one. So how do you feel you're doing on that? Just go ahead and mark that down. The next one is emotional health. And it says, I regularly ask God to create in me a pure heart, a heart filled with hope, faith, and love. On a day-to-day basis, what is your heart filled with? Faith, hope, love? Or is it filled with worry and anger or frustration or stress? So think about where is your heart and kind of think about where you are there. And go ahead and mark that down. No looking over anybody's shoulder, by the way. The next one is relational health. It says, I readily forgive others and pray about judgment issues I harbor against others. I easily admit my shortcomings and seek God's forgiveness so I can be a vessel of God's forgiveness to others. This is about my readiness, my heart, my relationship, and my readiness to forgive when there's forgiveness needed. And am I praying about those things? And am I trying to be a vessel of forgiveness to others? And that impacts my relationship. So am I a bridge builder or a bridge burner? Am I a fence mender or one who tears down fences in my relationship? So kind of assess that in your own spirit about that. And then the last one is material health. It says, I want the handling of my finances, my home, and my possessions to reflect godly stewardship. I act on the belief that all I have belongs to God. So do you see everything that you have as something that belongs to God, or do you see it as all mine, or maybe somewhere in between? So kind of rate yourself on that. So go ahead and make our last few notes, because this is important for us to make our own assessment of our own spiritual walls and where our lives are. So that's the first part of coming up with this. These are some of the first steps to rebuilding a vision, having a vision to rebuild our lives. Just like Nehemiah has having a vision to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So the next part, you notice that this sermon is built around 3 points. Isn't it? That's a great sermon, isn't it? 3 points, and we're done. So point number 2 is actually found in verses 16 to 18. So remember, Nehemiah has done all this secretly. He hasn't gone to the officials for an assessment. He hasn't asked all the leaders for an assessment. He's gone out and he's made an inspection and assessment himself so that he can come up with a plan to rebuild the walls. And that's what he's working on. And so he has to share the plans with someone else. And so he gets them motivated. And that's the next point, is that what Nehemiah does next is he gets other people motivated to do this, to rebuild. And he shares some things with them. So I know I said you wouldn't have to share this with anybody, but I'm going to suggest to you that if you do share it, it's probably going to help you, and it'd be more likely for you to actually follow through on it than if you don't share it. And that's part of that, is that sharing helps us to get motivated and helps to hold us accountable to that. So Nehemiah shares 2 things with the leaders. The first thing he shares is the problem, right? The walls are falling apart. I've seen them for myself. I've not only heard about it, but now I've seen it. And here's the problem. And we've got to do something about it, because I feel like we're a disgrace without these walls being rebuilt. So he shares the problem. And then he also shares the solution: rebuild the walls. It would be good for us to rebuild these walls. And here's the plan to rebuild. So he shares the problem and he shares the solution. And that's really how he casts vision, or he comes up. He's saying, this is the vision for what I can see happening. Now, he also says, and what the people agree to, is to get to work. You see, a wise gentleman once said to me, ideas only work if we do. It takes work to get to that place. Having the idea or having the vision is not enough. We actually have to work on it. And so one of the things I came across a great definition of work. I talked about it in Pastor's Ponderings this week. But the definition of work I came across is this: work is any effort to produce a new state of affairs. So work becomes joy-filled when we know we're working towards a new state of affairs. For example, yesterday I mowed my lawn, right? I looked out at my lawn that had not been mowed for 2 weeks. Ooh, yeah. The neighbors were starting to, give me the eyeball, going down the driveway. But, I haven't had time to mow the lawn, basically. So I get out there to mow the lawn, and I mow this lawn because what's the problem? My grass is too high. I got weeds coming up, right? That's the problem. What's the solution? I want a clean mowed lawn. What do I have to do? I have to get to work. And so I worked, and I mowed the lawn, and I stepped back, and I looked, and it looked great after I mowed it. And so I was experiencing what? A new state of affairs, right? Or in the wintertime when, you shovel your driveway, go out and it's snowed a foot or 6 inches, although we haven't had that for a while, but it's all that snow comes down, and the problem is I can't get out of my driveway, right? So I get out there, and what do? I get to work with my shovel or snow blower, and I clear the driveway. Now I have a new state of affairs, and I can get my car out of the driveway. So that's what work is. See, that's what work is, creating that new state of affairs. And it takes work to accomplish a vision or get to the vision for our lives or for our relationship with God. It takes work. And so getting motivated to get to work is what Nehemiah is doing with the leadership of Jerusalem. There's one other thing he shares with the leaders that I think is very important. He shares this. He says, the gracious hand of God. He talks about how the gracious hand of God had been upon him and at work in his life. See, what he was also saying was, folks, this isn't just about Nehemiah. This isn't about what Nehemiah wants. He's casting and he's saying, this is what God wants. God's trying to restore all of us. God wants us all to be restored, not just the walls of Jerusalem. And he's saying God's been a part of this, and he shares with them the ways that God has been at work, leading them to this point. And how do the people respond after he shares his vision and he shares that God's hand is in it? They say, good, let's get to work. They're ready to roll up their sleeves, they're motivated, they're ready to go and get to work. It's the same with us. We need to not only have a vision, but we also have to have the belief that God is working in our lives and working through us. And then the last, point 3, if you're still with me, point 3 is the last part, is actually in chapter 3. And this is in chapter 3. We're not going to read chapter 3 this morning, and we're not going to read chapter 3 next week. We're actually going to jump to chapter 4, because that's when we'll talk about the opposition to the work, which we see a little bit in chapter 2 today. But the reason we're not reading chapter 3 is because chapter 3 is a list of assignments for 41 groups. And so I thought I'd just kind of skip over that part, because I thought it might be hard to have a whole sermon around the assignments. But here's what Nehemiah is doing. That's the point 3 is he's organizing the work. He's organizing the work. And here's what Nehemiah does. He actually starts at the top of that map and makes assignments to all the gates around the whole walls of Jerusalem and all the different sections and all the different gates. And he assigns 41 groups to different sections and gates around the walls of Jerusalem. That's how he organizes everybody. But here's the thing that a lot of times people miss. One of the things he does as he organizes people is he organizes the groups, and he puts the groups to work on the wall, sections of the wall that are closest to their own homes. Now, why do you think he would do that? Why do you think Nehemiah would say, hey, this group, you guys live in this section of Jerusalem, you work on this section of the wall, which is closest to your house? What does that do for the investment of the work? How hard are they going to work on that section of the wall? Very hard. And are they going to do their best? Are they going to give 100%? Yeah, because that's the wall protecting their homes and their families. And so he's very wise in organizing the groups this way around the walls of Jerusalem. He says, Levites, I want you guys working over here next to the temple and protecting that section. And so he goes to all these 41 groups and he organizes them around the work of the wall. And so he got organized. A lot of times we have the faith and we have the vision, and we may even be willing to work, but we also need a plan. We need some way of planning to accomplish that vision. I was out last week because this is the other thing. I didn't mow my lawn last Sunday, because I went mountain biking. So that's the other part of the problem with getting your lawn done. But the reason I went out after church last week, I got home, got lunch, and I went out on my mountain bike, and I went out to Patapsco Park. In Patapsco Park, they had the first 100-mile mountain bike ride last weekend in the park. They started at 6 a.m. in the morning and went to 9 p.m. last Sunday night. They were riding on mountain bikes. Now, I'm not talking about paved roads or gravel roads. I'm talking about mountain biking on rocks and roots and all this stuff. And they designed a 33.3-mile loop in the park, in Patapsco Park, and they were riding that, and they had to do that 3 times. So I went out to check it out, I wanted to see some of the racers and ride part of the course. So I went out and I got on the course and I was riding, and of course I was sweating profusely about 20 minutes later. If you remember, last Sunday was hot and muggy, and I was sitting there going, how are these guys, men and women, surviving? And so I got to one of the checkpoints where some volunteers were, and of course gave me a reason to stop and chat and catch my breath. And I began talking with them. We were talking about the race, and they were talking about how what they said was, some people after the first lap, they quit. He said they blew up. The slang term is they blew up, which means they went out too fast, too hard, they didn't have a plan, and they didn't finish the race because they had no plan. They had the belief that they could do it, you see. They thought that they could do it. They had the energy, they had the motivation, they had all these great things, but they didn't plan for 100 miles. And after they got through the first loop, they gave up, they quit, they DQ'd, disqualified. Many of them young. He said some of these guys were pretty young, in the 20s. The guys that were winning it were in their 40s, just a point. Because one of the things that old guys do that young guys don't do is they've learned to plan a little bit. Or they have queens that help them plan. Either way. So what there's going on here is what happened was they didn't have a race plan. And if you're going to ride 100 miles on a mountain bike all day, you better have a race plan. You better have a plan in place. And here are the plans you need to ride 100 miles on a mountain bike. First of all, you need to have a plan of how you're going to pace yourself. Because you're riding 100 miles, not 30 miles. But if you act like you're riding 30 miles, that's all you're going to ride. So going too hard, too fast you'll burn out. The other thing is that they also had to come up with a maintenance plan, because mountain bikes get flat tires, they get chains break, brakes fall apart because all the mud and gunk and everything gets caught up in it and they break. So every once in a while you got to have a plan to stop, get off your bike and do some maintenance to it. And they actually had stations around the course where you could pop your bike off and get maintenance done to your bike. So you had to have a plan for when that was going to happen. There's one other thing that we do even when we're not riding a mountain bike all day. What do we do all day, or different times of the day, even when we're not mountain biking? What do we do when we got up this morning? What are we going to do when we get home from church this afternoon? What are we going to do this evening? We're going to eat, right? And we're going to drink. And we're not riding mountain bikes, right? So they've got to come up with a plan to replenish all the calories that they're burning. So they've got to figure out, how am I going to feed myself and get nourishment and drink and water and Gatorade or whatever over that 100-mile period. And if you don't have those 3 plans in place, you're not going to finish 100 miles on a mountain bike. That's the point. Without a plan, we're going to blow up. So here's the thought here, and it's the last, further in your outline today. It says this: faith without planning leads to false starts. That's the blank. Fill in the blank. Faith without planning leads to false starts. That's what I learned last week when I went out to the park. Is that they had the motivation, they had the belief, but they didn't have the plan. And so they had a false start. But here's the other truth, or the other biblical principle that I want to also hold out for you. Planning without faith leads to false saints. Planning without faith leads to false saints. Because we can have all the best plans, all the best organization, but if God is not in it, I'm just being a false saint. If God is not about it, we're just being false saints. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, if I have all the knowledge and I have the faith that can move mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. So we can be false saints even with all the great plans that we have. So you got those 3 things? First one is what? Assess the situation. Number 2, Get motivated. Number 3, organize the work. Got it? We still haven't done one thing, and I want to wrap up by sharing one more thing, and that's our key verse this week. It's on the back of your bulletins in bold. It's also in chapter 2, verse 20. You see, because what we'll talk about next week is the opposition to the building. These guys, that we can't pronounce their names, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And these guys are starting to oppose the work of rebuilding. And we'll talk next week about how do we deal with opposition and resistance, because that always comes. It always comes. So how do we deal with it? But notice how, in this chapter 2, how Nehemiah deals with it. What is Nehemiah's response to the complaints and to the complaints that come to him and the anger that he's receiving from these other leaders around him? It says this. He says, "The God of heaven will help us succeed." And all throughout chapter 1 and chapter 2, we are constantly reminded that these are God's plans that are put in Nehemiah's hearts. This is a part of God's vision for the people of Israel. So what Nehemiah is saying is, if God is in this, who can be against us? It says in Romans, right? If God is for us, who can be against us? That's what he's saying. He's just saying something that we already know from the New Testament. He's saying God's going to help us succeed. God is in this, folks. And it doesn't matter if you want to complain and be resistant or whatever anger. If God is in this, this is going to happen. This is going to succeed. I think that's important for us also in our own faith life, within our own vision for our own life. If we just depend on our own strength and our own ability, guess what? It's going to be hard. But if we trust that God is strengthening us, like the kids reminded us this morning to what? Stand strong, right? In God. And that they're reminding us of that great truth and that great promise. And so I want to remind us of that and close just with this. One of the things I have been asked to do is give a stewardship report. So I'm going to do that, but I really want to do it in a different way. I'm not just giving a report. I really want to share a little bit about my heart, a little bit, about what goes on in a pastor's heart. Does that make sense? Because I get the stewardship reports. And so I think this is a great way to illustrate what I'm talking about. We did a stewardship campaign, annual commitment drive this year, and we had everybody turn in pledge cards in the beginning of June. And after all those pledge cards come in, then we sent out a letter reminding people to turn in other pledge cards, and that went out. And each week on my desk, I get a report about people. I don't get names or anything. I just get a kind of a summary report of pledges that have come in, the amount of pledges, and how we can, because that helps us to plan for the coming year. And I get a comparison to last year when on all these reports. And so the first report came in, and it was lower than last year. The second report came in, it was lower than last year. So I kept waiting, like, is it going to pick up? Is something going to change? Because for the past 3 years, we've been very good. I mean, people have been very generous. And so this is the first time I'm starting to see that kind of things aren't, going the way I would hope financially. So basically, the report I have today is that, and it's actually in your bulletins. You don't need to look at it right now, but if you want more details, it's in your bulletin. But what was going on in my heart was, are we going to have enough? Is there going to be enough? Because we had less pledges. We had 290 families pledge this year. Last year we had 299. And also the amount is about 6 to 7% less than it was last year. So I'm starting to kind of read into that. So what does that mean for us over the coming year? Because, I'm the lead pastor, so I'm the one that loses sleep over these things, right? So I kept wrestling with that, and I kept waiting for something to change. And, I kept wondering we've asked people to be generous. We've asked people to pray about it. And actually, we had someone come into the office one day, and this kind of captured my heart and captured the situation. And they came in and they turned in their pledge, and they apologized that they couldn't do more. And I said, oh, you should never apologize if this is what God has you doing. If this is what God has asked you to do, that's all we ask. See, because what I'm also realizing, the people now, we're starting to get hit. We have a lot of government sector workers and contract workers, and there's sequestration happening, right? Furloughs, people have lost jobs, and that's all beginning to hit us in this area in a way that wasn't happening before. And so I'm assuming that that's part of that. But then I went back and I read Nehemiah. And I read this verse. That if God is in this, we got nothing to worry about. God will help us succeed. Do we trust God? That's the question. Do we trust God? Do we have faith in God? And God was kind of reminding Matt, and he said, God, you know, whose church is this, Matt? It's God's church. And God has brought us this far, right? Is God not going to take us the rest of the way? Even if the walls are only half built, is God not going to help us to complete the work that God has called us to? Absolutely. God is going to help us succeed. God is going to help us finish the work that God has called us to. And that's trust. And that's faith. And that's God's promise to us for our own lives. That no matter where we're at, God will help us to succeed in the vision that God has put in our hearts for our lives. So don't give up. Amen.